In 1859, a human rights activist named Henry Dunant, who would later co-found the Red Cross, observed the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino between French, Piedmontese, and Austrian armies in northern Italy. He was shocked by the treatment of wounded soldiers on the battlefield. He worked diligently to bring together a variety of governments to sign on to a series of rules governing the treatment of captured and wounded soldiers signed in Geneva in 1864. These would become known as the First Geneva Conventions. It took another 85 years, however, before the world began to think about the treatment of civilians in wartime. In horror at the German treatment of civilians during World War II, the Geneva Conventions were expanded in 1949 to protect non-combatant civilians. This was accomplished in the Fourth Geneva Convention, designed to protect civilians by encouraging military actors to separate themselves from civilian populations. The 1977 edition protocols made clear the use of human shields was absolutely forbidden by the rules of war. Article 12.4 states, quote, "Under no circumstances shall medical units be used in an attempt to shield military objectives from attack." Article 51.7 states, quote, "The presence or movements of the civilian population or individual civilians shall not be used to render certain points or areas immune from military operations, in particular in attempts to shield military objectives from attacks or to shield, favor, or impede military operations." Article 8.2b of the 1998 ICC statute says, quote, "Utilizing the presence of a civilian or other protected person to render certain points, areas, or military forces immune from military operations constitutes a war crime in international armed conflicts." The purpose of outlawing human shields is perfectly obvious. No country can be expected to forego its military aims in order to protect civilians deliberately placed in danger by the enemy. To immunize those who use human shields would incentivize everyone to take human shields, which would then necessitate the death of more civilians in order to achieve military goals. And yet, the legacy media and the political left have been doing just that. They know that Hamas has been using human shields. Hamas brags about it. Over the weekend, Israeli Defense Forces discovered rocket launchers planted directly next to children's pools and playgrounds. Currently, Hamas is preventing the evacuation of Gazan civilians to the south of the Gaza Strip. Hamas is blocking people from leaving for the south. Meanwhile, over at the Al-Shifa hospital, the home base for Hamas's military headquarters, below which is likely stored hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel for use by terrorists, the electricity is still on, despite claims that the fuel has run out. Not only that, large crowds of Gazans have congregated around the hospital to cheer on footage of Hamas members firing on Israelis. Hamas not only keeps military headquarters underground, underneath hospitals, it literally built one hospital, the Indonesian hospital, above terror infrastructure it had already built. To cap it all off, Hamas spent the weekend attacking Israeli troops as those Israeli troops were attempting to open a civilian corridor from north to south. So the IDF was working to open the roads so civilians could leave. Hamas began firing mortars and anti-tank missiles at them. The story here is actually very, very simple. Israel wishes, for reasons both moral and political, to minimize civilian casualties among Gazan Palestinian Arabs. Hamas wants more dead Palestinian Arabs. The difference is why the IDF has made 20,000 phone calls, dropped 1.5 million leaflets, sent 4.4 million SMS and 6 million voice messages, urging civilians in northern Gaza to evacuate temporarily for their safety. Never has one army opposing a military force sent as many warnings to civilians to get out. You literally cannot name another time this has happened. Now, Hamas claims that some 6,500 female and child civilians have been killed thus far. We haven't verified any of those numbers because Hamas routinely lies about this sort of stuff. Hamas's advocates point to those numbers to suggest that Israel is killing a disproportionate number of civilians, despite the fact that it's Hamas that wants them to kill the civilians. Well, folks, you're hearing a lot about civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip. And of course, civilian casualties are incredibly terrible, which is why Israel is attempting to minimize them while Hamas is putting its own civilians directly in the line of fire, hoping to maximize them so then they can claim immunity from the world community. But here is the deal. Every war, unfortunately, has lots of civilian casualties, and what Israel is doing is about as meticulous a job as any military could ever be expected to do. Let's go through some history. At least 2 million German civilians died during World War II. At least 350,000 were killed by strategic Allied bombing. Up to 800,000 Japanese civilians died during World War II. In the Korean War, estimates place civilian casualty numbers at 1.2 million. During the Vietnam War, some 365,000 civilians died. During the Gulf War, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 civilians died at the hands of Allied forces. During NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, at least 1,200 civilians were killed. You may remember that America was not attacked before either of those last two engagements. During the Afghanistan War, at least 46,000 civilians died. During the Iraq War, those numbers were at least 200,000. Barack Obama's drone war killed at least 400 civilians. His Libya war killed at least 600. The war on ISIS may have killed several thousand civilians. Those are just wars involving the United States. When it comes to military action in the Middle East more generally, the numbers are astounding. The Saudis have killed at least 20,000 civilians in their bombing campaign in Yemen. At least 85,000 children have died of starvation during that conflict. In Syria, at least 300,000 civilians have died. At least 12 million people have been displaced. Pakistan right now is, like this moment, deporting some 1.7 million Afghan civilians. Nobody cares about any of that. There's not been a single protest about any of that. No one cares. However, hundreds of thousands, millions, nay, billions of protesters seem to care about the Jews, even though the Jews are overtly attempting to avoid civilian casualties, while Hamas seeks as many dead Palestinian Arabs as possible. And yet the media continue to pretend that Hamas isn't to blame for civilians being killed, that Israel somehow has the magical, undisclosed ability to kill terrorists without killing the civilians that terrorists use as their shields. They have the Harry Potter-like ability to cast spells that just kill the bad guys. Here's Bernie Sanders idiotically expressing just that idea.
How should Israel destroy Hamas post-attack on these innocent civilians in Israel without hurting, killing innocent men, women, and children when Hamas is hiding behind them and putting them in danger? How does that work?
Well, that is exactly the right question to be asked the military experts, of which I am not one. But clearly, yeah, Israel has a right to defend itself. Hamas has sworn that's what its goal is to destroy Israel. They got to deal with that. But there got to be a better way than killing thousands of men, women, and children. So once again, the immediate concern is you got to have a pause in the bombing.
That's amazing stuff from Bernie Sanders there, openly saying that he has no idea what Israel is supposed to do, that he's not a military man, but he knows there has to be this is very reminiscent of when Joe Biden and company talk about police taking on bad guys, and they say, why don't you just shoot them in the leg? If you don't know what the hell you're talking about, this sounds good. But if you do, this sounds like a moron, because Bernie Sanders is, in fact, a moron, because he has always been a moron. This lie that Israel is somehow being indiscriminate in its use of military force, that they have secretly a better way of just killing terrorists but not killing anyone else. Well, the thing is that theory justifies everything up to and including the genocidal October 7th attacks. That is the point, to create a retroactive justification for those attacks in the public mind. If the Jews are the kinds of people who drop bombs on Gazan babies just for fun, then what's the big deal that Hamas shot babies directly in the face and raped their mothers before murdering them? That is the case being made by the congresswoman from Hamas, Rashida Tlaib, who spent the weekend defending Hamas's genocidal slogans. She tweeted out, quote, "From the river to the sea is an aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence, not death, destruction, or hate." This, of course, is a lie. From the river to the sea, meaning the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine must be free, is a slogan about freedom in the same way that the Nazi slogan, Arbeit macht frei, was about encouragement to work ethic. Work makes free. What they actually meant, that was the sign over Auschwitz. The only side currently advocating genocide is the Palestinian side. Of course, it doesn't take much to get Palestinian advocates to admit as much. Here, for example, was the Palestinian ambassador to the UK explaining this weekend he would not condemn Hamas's atrocities at all.
Palestinian Authority hasn't condemned Hamas adequately and those October 7th attacks. So do you want to clear the air and clearly condemn the attack in Hamas today?
No, I want to clear the record. First of all, the Palestinian Authority is not what represents the Palestinian people. It's the PLO. It's the Palestine Liberation Organization. I represented the PLO in Washington. Now I represent the PLO in London. The PA does not have external arms. The sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people is the PLO. Number two, let me clarify another matter. It's the state of Palestine that will take over and protect its people in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and in Gaza once the Palestinian occupied territory is liberated.
These are decades worth of problems. I'm just asking about this one specific issue on October 7th and the tax revenue.
Not the kids. No, it's the result of us not really focusing on the root cause. This is the moment of the U.S.
I understand there are deep root causes, but on that specific condemnation, it would just be a very quick answer.
And allow me, Margaret, because I watched your interview with the Israeli ambassador, and he said two things very important. He said, those are unintended consequences, the 10,000 innocent people, the almost 5,000 children. I want to also clear the record here. This is deliberate, and this has been the Israeli military doctrine since its establishment.
Okay, so he's a liar and an evil human being. He's literally saying that he will not condemn Hamas's massacre of innocents and then justifying that by claiming that Israel is targeting civilians, which is a lie. Again, the only way to justify Hamas's evil is to accuse Israel of similar evil, which is precisely what Rashida Tlaib is doing. She put out an ad targeting Joe Biden, suggesting that he is supporting a genocide. She literally is putting in her own ad people chanting for the destruction of the state of Israel and then claiming that Israel is pursuing a genocide accompanied by Joe Biden. Here's the thing. The goal for those who support Hamas is not, in the end, to truly convince everyone that Israel is morally inferior to its opponents, because that's not possible. You can't convince anyone that anyone is morally inferior to Hamas. It's to convince everyone that Hamas and Israel are morally equivalent, that Israel is on Hamas's level so as to justify Hamas's atrocities. In that game, Hamas's most ardent advocates are joined by politically savvy but morally despicable figures like Barack Obama. Barack Obama spent the weekend pretending that responsibility for Hamas's evil lies with, with everyone. Here he is with his fellow dolts over at Pod Save America.
You have to take in the whole truth. And you then have to admit nobody's hands are clean. All of us are complicit to some degree. I look at this and I think back, what could I have done during my presidency to move this forward as hard as I tried? I've got the scars to prove it. But there's a part of me that's still saying, well, was there something else I could have done? That's the conversation we should be having. Not just looking backwards, but looking forward.
Now, of course, Obama himself is guilty. His hands are not clean. He handed billions of dollars to the Iranian terror regime. He allowed them to spread their cash and their terror all over the Middle East, from Yemen to Lebanon, while simultaneously giving Israel the back of his hand. In June 2014, when Hamas kidnapped and murdered 3 Israeli teenagers, including 1 American dual citizen, Barack Obama said nothing for 3 weeks and then finally called on Israel for restraint. He also delayed a shipment of Hellfire missiles to Israel in the middle of Israel's 2014 war with Hamas. Then, on his way out of office, Obama abstained from voting on a UN Security Council resolution rather than vetoing it. That resolution demanded that Israel stop building in all of Judea, Samaria, and East Jerusalem, and created an incentive structure for the boycott and divest movement from the state of Israel. As an Israeli official said at the time, quote, the U.S. administration secretly cooked up with the Palestinians an extreme anti-Israeli resolution behind Israel's back, which would be a tailwind for terror and boycotts and effectively make the Western Wall occupied Palestinian territory. Obama's hatred for Israel was, in fact, a significant factor in building up both Iran and Hamas, leading to the catastrophe of October 7th. So yes, Barack Obama does personally bear a share of responsibility. But that's not what he means. He means that everyone is responsible for October 7th, which means that Hamas is not responsible. It's a cycle of violence, a morally relativistic cycle of violence requiring Israeli concessions.